Welcome to Compose Yourself, the podcast where academic writing meets self-discovery for the students at the Chicago School.
I'm Jason.
And I'm Cindy.
Whether you're crafting your first essay or refining your voice as a writer, we're here to guide you through the art of composition.
From brainstorming to final drafts, we'll break down the tools and techniques to help you think critically, write effectively, and express yourself with confidence.
So, grab a pen, open your mind, and
compose yourself.
Welcome to the Module 4 podcast. So in this week's episode, we're going to talk about the idea of synthesis and really try to explore how our students can use it, what it means, how they'll use it in the future. And, before we begin, I kind of have to be honest that I feel like we were both a little nervous about this episode. Um, Cindy, why do you think that is? Why was this such a struggle?
I don't know. I mean, obviously we have been because let's be honest, we've delayed talking about this topic today. And I think it's because it is a difficult skill. And I think we're concerned how we can talk with our students about synthesis without intimidating them. And because I still feel like it's a difficult skill when I try to write. I think when I work with doctoral students, they still find it difficult to create synthesis and to create literature reviews. These are difficult skills. So I think we're
They
just
are.
struggling with how to frame it so that our students understand that while these skills are important and they're part of the work that we're doing in this class, we really want them to understand that we expect it to be difficult. We don't expect it to be perfect, and we do want them to give it their best. So
Right. Right.
I think we want to demystify something that is inherently a bit misty. So that's troubling to us.
It is, especially because, I think we want them to succeed, but I don't want them to feel too intimidated, right? Which I think was kind of the flip side of why it was a struggle to develop this episode is that, yes, this is hard. Yes, your recommended reading or is a video for PhD doctoral students. We get that, but we want you to try or want them to try. So finding that balance between something that's really difficult, but just starting out in it and being okay with that is a struggle. So I think it's important that they just realize we know that their instructors will understand that we are in this instance, we will hold their hand. We're just saying let's go for a walk and we're going to get you through it. So, kind of with that out of the way and with that understanding, everybody take a deep breath.
Yeah, right.
What is synthesis? Um, so let's start with a quick definition. Cindy, how would you define synthesis?
I think synthesis is bringing together the different source material that you have read about a topic and bringing it into conversation with one another. So, if our students have had English 100 with us, this isn't a brand new topic because we talk so much in English 100 about discourse communities and making sure that they understand that when you're talking about a certain topic, there is a discourse around that topic in the academic space. And when you research a topic, what you're doing is trying to understand the existing discourse around this topic. And what you're doing when you synthesize, say in a literature review, is you bring all of those people together who were having discourse about this topic and you present it to your reader. So you're trying to bring the themes together. This essentially you're trying to bring together the topic in a way that your reader can understand the conversation without having read the stuff themselves, without having been involved in the conversation themselves. So I think that's the difficulty is striking the balance between presenting what all of the scholars that you read said about a thing without going into too much detail or, only
Right.
ever citing your sentences are all citations and you don't speak yourself in there. And And then there's the struggle of the literature review where you're not really giving opinions, you're just telling the reader about the discourse, what's being said about this topic, what research has been done. I think there are lots of
Right.
layers of things that are difficult. What do you think, Jason?
You know, it kind of reminded me, I want to go back in the Module 6 episode from last season for English 100. We briefly touched on synthesis and we used that dinner party analogy. So I recommend going back, maybe reviewing that episode. But I think then connecting it to what we're doing now, you have to be present as well. And I think this is something even I struggled with a lot, that it was easier, in quotation marks, for me to just paraphrase what everybody else was saying. And then it's kind of like I stopped there. And that act of synthesis was moving beyond just paraphrasing what everybody else said. It's finding that meaning. Like,
Hmm.
so what? Why did they say this? Why is it significant or important? Because at the end of the day, if my reader wanted to go read those other sources, they would. Right? So that they're looking for my input, my take, how this connects to the argument I'm making, how, how maybe I'm showing that two people disagree. Right? Because it's not even always agreement. Like person A, person B, person C, they all said this and they all agreed. End of story. That's kind of boring. Where's the antagonism? Where's the tension? Where are the two fighting in such a way that what I have to say is important or significant itself.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think it's important to also remember that you can't remove yourself from the process of synthesis from a literature review, because if not, it's just a summary or a paraphrase.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I also think it's important, like what you're saying really brings to mind for me that if you and I read the same seven sources about the same topic, you and I would still write different paragraphs, different literature review, different assessment of those sources because we are different writers. So we've talked about that before as well, that different readers make different writers. And the way that I synthesize information isn't going to look the way that you do. The way our students do it isn't going to look the way that we would do it. And that's not wrong. It's
Right.
just that there are different ways to summarize a topic and present information. Like if you and I go see a movie, we saw the same movie, we sat in the same theater maybe. But if somebody asks us to describe the movie or give a plot summary, even just a basic plot summary, we're not going to say the same things because you may have valued different scenes in the movie than I did. You may have
Right.
connected with a different character than I did. So I think synthesis also comes down to, I should say, I think the most important part of a successful synthesis of information is your own curiosity. It's what's
Right.
interesting to you. What did you take from the topics that you read about that resonated with you, that made sense to you, that made you feel interested in the topic? That's the best kind of synthesis there is. When did you read something and think, oh, this reminds me of this thing that I read in this other article. It reminds me of the point that this person made. It reminds me of how this connects. That's synthesis. What does it remind you of? Where are you seeing common themes? And hopefully that's different for lots of people, right?
It is. And it's kind of interesting. In English 100, we started it off with a conversation of voice. And we did, it's kind of the easier, more voice-centered assignments like a narrative. And we slowly moved up to academic writing, and we told our students, now that you're in academic writing, there are certain expectations in this discourse community. Be more formal, be kind of more neutral or as objective as possible. And I know that a lot of students really struggled to find their voice in this new setting. Now that we're in English 200, we are firmly in academic territory. We're firmly in academic writing. But what you just said, and this idea of synthesis in the literature review, that is your voice. It's kind of like your
Hmm.
voice re-emerging again, right? You're not just, I mean, you're still being formal. You're still kind of writing toward that academic discourse community. But those unique insights or unique connections you make, that is your voice. So I really love even having to remind myself of that, that you are the meaning maker and putting yourself in there, you're that perspective. That's the central point that makes it so interesting to read. That's why somebody else wants to look at it.
Yeah. And I think that's also the reason why a literature review is not an annotated bibliography. Like I know we've talked about that before, but I think it's an important point here because an annotated bibliography maybe doesn't have as much of that voice because it's really a specific document for a specific purpose. It's like, okay, this is what it's a summary, I'm giving a summary of an article and then I'm telling you what I think I might use it for in my own paper, let's say. Um, there isn't going to be a lot of craft, to that, a lot of meaning making. It's like, this is what it is, and this is why I think it's useful to me. When you go to then do the magical work of reading all that stuff, giving it some time in your brain, because your brain is a meaning maker. I mean, think about the ways that we make meaning out of almost nothing all the time. Something random happens and we're giving it 5 layers of meaning. Um, that's how our brain works. We want things to mean something, so it like
Right,
makes
right.
connections. And that's why a literature review is the connections. It's not this article is this article said this article said this, because that's the lack of connection that I sometimes see when students are trying, they're reading stuff and they know it has, it has meaning, but they haven't made the connection. So that to me is the difference. It's when the threads start to come together and you get some synthesis, some a tapestry going of what this topic is about and what researchers have done, as opposed to just presenting them sort of in a linear way.
Right, right. Which, interesting again, I don't know why I'm on a nostalgia kick for English 100 right now. But it's kind of like those rhetorical appeals we talked about. This is also a strategy to appeal to logos,
Yes.
right? Because you're taking all of these different sources, 5 different sources, um, and you are creating connections between them. And so you really need to be careful to do that in such a way that your audience understands the connection, right? Like I never want to assume that my reader knows what's going on in my head.
Yes.
But the flip side of that is that if I can do that well, if I can employ those strategies to appeal to logos well, put my own voice in, make my own meaning out of all of these different sources, then I am going to appeal to the logos of my audience, right?
That's
My
so
reader's going
funny.
to look at that and just, oh, this is beautiful. I love it.
Yes.
Hopefully.
So what you're saying is you don't want someone to say, so and so said this, new paragraph. So 'cause it feels like sometimes the temptation is to summarize and then just sort of drop the mic and walk away. Like I'm
Right,
supposed to
right.
somehow know what you think that means. Like your reader is supposed to somehow know what you mean. Like, okay, that person said that, or they
Like
did that
doing the
research.
setup
What
or
does
build
that
up for a
mean?
joke, but then there's no punchline.
No punchline.
You're
Yeah.
like, why aren't you laughing? Laugh at me, you
Right.
know?
Tell me what the context is. Analyze this for me. I call that like making your reader do the heavy lifting. So, if your reader is busy the whole time trying to figure out what does that mean? How is that connected? Why does this topic logically follow this one? Why are these two things related? Then you're making your reader do all the heavy lifting. Like, essentially, you want your reader to sit back, relax, and let you take them on a journey through the discourse surrounding a topic. I want to leave feeling like I know stuff because you knew stuff and you explained it to me in a way that was helpful. So
Right.
I think that's what we're trying to really drive is this isn't going to be an easy process, but it is going to be, there's going to be a lot of learning that takes place when you have to
Right.
make these connections. And will you be perfect at literature review and never have to practice again? No. But
We're
you'll,
still practicing.
right. I'm still practicing. Um, but you will know next time you encounter it. What am I supposed to do with this? What's the process? How do I get the reading done? How do I get the note taking done? And how do I bring it together? And that's really our goal for our students, right? Is to
Right.
give them a process to use and give them opportunities to practice it.
Which, and I'm really glad you brought up note taking too, is that I think this is a great time to go back and look at all the notes that everybody's taken. Um, because it also demonstrates that research as a process that we talked about a few episodes ago, right? That the seeds, the kernels of some of these connections that you can make in a literature review, I will find them in my annotation. Maybe it was one of the questions that I asked in an article. Maybe it was some brainstorming. I strongly recommend that everybody, that all of my students create their outline. Take a look at that rough draft outline, start filling it out, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But then I start kind of free writing. Maybe I have some ideas and I've free written a little under my outline, go back, I'll look at that, and then that gives me another insight to help me when I do synthesis because I'm like, oh, I made this connection without realizing it. And now that I'm sitting and staring at a blank page, it's almost like writer's block. But that's why you do the work beforehand. That's why this is that process.
Yeah.
That's why you have those notes. And, so I always feel like I've had so many students in the past who did such excellent work, and then they do stare at that blank page without kind of returning to what they've already done. And it's like,
Hmm.
don't give up on your work. You've already done all this. Use it. I didn't spend all day tilling a garden just to sit there and say, well, I have to build a new garden. Like, no, you already did the work. Plant the
Hmm.
seeds.
Yep.
Um,
I agree with that. I think it's looking for those, just realizing that synthesis is a process that happens in your brain, and then it's a process that happens on the page. It's a process
right.
that happens when we read stuff and it connects and we understand and we come to a sense of meaning in the things that we've read, and we come to a sense of what we think matters about what we've read. And then we put that on the page to the best of our ability, which will change over time. So I think it's important for our students to understand it as a process and also a thing that they're going to do on the page. Um, Without getting too in the weeds on it. I also think it's really important to just briefly point out that synthesis also really relies heavily on making sure that you're citing things correctly so that your reader's always aware of whose voice they're hearing, of which source is being brought into the conversation and how it links with maybe another source that's in the
Mhm.
conversation. So I do think that there's also that like APA technical skill that's coming in when you're talking about synthesis because you've got to keep a hold of the different voices that are coming in. And you also have to give them meaning with your own voice.
And we do that in every day. Kind of going back to that dinner party analogy that we alluded to from English 100. If I just sat here and imagine that there's five people at a dinner party, but you and I are talking. So, well, he said this and she said that, and then he said this. You would sit there and you'd say, like, who are you talking about?
Right.
Right? Like I need some kind of guidance, some kind of signpost to tell me so I understand who's talking.
Hmm.
So that's what the API citations really are in this case. They're showing us who's saying what.
Right.
And that helps keep us on track.
Yep.
But I mean, otherwise, I know we've kind of defined it by walking around. Like we did give a definition, but then we've just kind of like looked at and shared and explored some ideas. I think it would be helpful to end on maybe, what tips or tricks do you have that might help our students do the best they can on the literature review?
I think the number one thing for me is reread your notes. Um, we talk about this a lot, I know, but doing that second or third pass at the things that I noted that I thought were important, and then identifying the key themes. If you're reading about a certain topic, there are going to be a few things that jump out that everybody's talking about. And maybe it won't be the first thing that you read, but over time, you're going to find those themes that help you give the reader a really helpful overview of that topic. So I guess essentially read your notes and try to hunt those themes down. But then my second tip would be Write for a reader. Remember that someone's going to read this and you're presenting them with the information as you read it. You shouldn't want your reader to have to go read the articles themselves to understand the topic and to contextualize it in your own topic. So if I could get students to just remember their reader always, picture a person that's going to read it. Maybe it's me, maybe it's Jason, maybe it's your friend, whoever. Somebody's going to read it. And if they want to understand what you understand, what do they need to know?
That's great. That's great. Because I think especially in this digital age, we do forget that we're writing for a reader. We just think, I'm just sending it off anonymously, done. But it's that context, it's that audience, it's that purpose that really matters here. I think the
Even
final,
even academic writing is communication.
right,
So I
right.
think it's important to remember that we're always communicating. That's what writing is. It's communication. And it has maybe different specifications about how you do it in certain discourse communities, like academic writing, but it is still communication, right? You're still
It is.
talking, you're still telling somebody about something.
I love that. And I think the final piece of advice I would give is that I always found it easier to do my literature reviews when I had a solid working thesis and a pretty decent outline of the argument I was making, because that
Absolutely.
allowed me, it's easier for me to make meaning when I have a purpose, when I have a position, when I know what is it I'm trying to argue for, what is it I'm trying to say. Sometimes you may not know, and that makes it more difficult because
Mm,
then, okay, I can identify the themes, I see the different trends, where these art authors agree and disagree, and then it comes to the question of so what? Why is this significant for me? And I don't know. So I recommend that everybody, I always recommend go back. If you don't have a thesis yet, create a working
mhm.
thesis, have a rough idea of what it is that you're trying to argue. And I think that makes synthesis a little easier, at least for me.
I agree. I think one tip that I would give that I always do when I'm writing a longer paper is I write my working thesis on a piece of paper, a post-it note, whatever, and I put it in front of me while I'm writing. It's right there because you can get off track really easily or forget,
Very
like
easy.
chase rabbits or whatever. And it really helps me keep my brain focused on, it's almost like priming your brain. We're writing about this thing, nothing else. We're writing
Right.
about this thing. So it really does help to just keep it forefront of your mind. But I think it's really wise to make an outline because it can be difficult to create a path. It's like a map. An outline is a map. It's hard to tell your reader where you're going without a map. You
Right.
need a path to get there. So I do think outlines are really, really helpful, um, especially as it pertains to lit review.
I agree. All right. Well, that's going to be it for this episode. Next week, we are going to talk about kind of how to take all of these different pieces and put them together. And we're going to dive a little bit more into analysis.
Sounds great. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Compose Yourself.
Remember, writing is a process, and every word you write brings you closer to becoming the writer you want to be.
We hope you enjoyed today's discussion and that it makes clearer the topics you're exploring in this course. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to your instructor.
Until next time, keep thinking critically
And always compose yourself.